Bloodborne is a game so packed with secrets, references, and hidden details that even after a decade of players combing through every corner of Yharnam, the community is still finding things most people never saw. And this video collects 307 of them in one place, so you can finally go through all of them without having to dig through a decade of Reddit threads and datamine spreadsheets to do it. I put this together because I wanted something that covered Bloodborne's Easter eggs in a way that actually did them justice. A lot of these details get buried in patch notes threads, community wikis, and datamine documents that most people will never sit down and read through. When I was assembling this, I made a deliberate choice to order the eggs thematically rather than by location or discovery date. That meant some of the more famous ones ended up later in the video than you might expect, and some of the tiny, easy-to-miss environmental details ended up near the front. That felt right to me. The small stuff deserves to be seen first. Everything after the big obvious secrets assumes you already know the big obvious secrets, which is probably true if you are watching this video. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button, so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. Chapter 1. The architecture of hidden things there is a window in the upper ward of central Yharnam that has a different bloodstain pattern depending on whether the player has rung the small resonant bell in the area or not. Most players never ring that bell during a first playthrough, so most players never notice the shift. It is a tiny environmental detail that costs nothing to include and rewards almost nobody, which is kind of the whole philosophy behind how From Software hides things in the first place. They put the effort in knowing that most people will never see the result. That ratio does not seem to bother them, and when you start cataloguing these details, it becomes clear why. The details reinforce each other. Even the ones no one sees contribute to the feeling that the ones you do see are part of something larger. The lamps that hunters use to fast travel are shaped like the letter Y when viewed from directly above. This has been noted in community discussions for years, and the prevailing read is that it is a reference to Yharnam itself, the city that functions as both location and trap. The lamp is what pulls you back when you want to leave. It is what the city gives you instead of an exit. If you look at the physical design of the lamp from ground level, it is a perfectly ordinary lantern on a post. You have to be above it, looking down, which the game never positions you to do by default, to see the letter. Most players never see it. The lamp does its job as a metaphor for the city, whether or not anyone notices. When you first arrive in the hunter's dream and pick up your first weapon, the doll is standing with her back to you. She does not turn until you have already made your choice. One interpretation is that your selection happens before she acknowledges you as a hunter, as if the dream itself is indifferent to which tool you pick up. Another read is simpler, that her back is turned because your arrival has not fully registered yet, and the turning marks the moment the dream becomes aware of you as a participant rather than a visitor. Either way, the choreography is deliberate. You make your choice alone. She waits. The music that plays during the cleric beast encounter contains a chord progression that appears, in a shortened and altered form, during the Murgo's wet nurse fight near the end of the game. These two encounters bookend the player's understanding of what beasts actually are. At the cleric beast, you do not yet know what you are fighting or why. By the wet nurse, you have enough context to understand the horror of what has happened to these creatures, and the musical callback is the game suggesting it was aware of that arc from the beginning. The composer, Yuka Kitamura, has spoken in general terms about the interconnected nature of the game's soundtrack, though not about this specific connection. Players made the connection independently, and the timing works out across both fights in a way that holds up to analysis. Father Gascoigne's hunter coat has a small tear near the left shoulder that his daughter's coat does not share. Players who interact with the small girl through the window and then find Gascoigne in the later area can notice the difference between the two garments. The tear is consistent with a graze wound sustained before the night began, which means Gascoigne entered the hunt already injured. The game does not describe when or how this happened. It gives you the tear and trusts you to wonder about it. His daughter's coat is pristine, and the contrast between the two makes the tear feel like the beginning of a story the game is not going to finish for you. There is a bloodstain left by another player that appears with unusual frequency near the entrance to Old Yharnam. The community largely agrees this is a developer-placed phantom bloodstain, not a genuine player death location, used to signal danger and direct the player's attention upward toward the distant bell-ringing woman. From Software plants these deliberately in key locations across their games, going back to Demon's Souls. The Old Yharnam bloodstain is positioned so that when the player triggers it and watches the ghost fall, the angle of the fall naturally draws the eye upward toward the exact tower where the sniper sits. It is a tutorial that does not call itself a tutorial. It works on players who have never heard of the technique. The name Iosefka is derived from the Slavic form of Josephine, which historically carried connotations of increase and addition, rooted in a phrase meaning may he add. The Iosefka seen at the end of her questline, who has been experimenting on refugees and adding them to her collection of specimens, fits this etymology in a way that is either completely intentional or an extremely good coincidence. The name was localized from Japanese, and the etymology would have been accessible to anyone researching period European naming conventions while building a Victorian-era setting. From Software's writers have a documented practice of using meaningful names, so the coincidence explanation is probably the less likely one. Alfred's set of armour has a faint embossed pattern on the breastplate that, when viewed up close in photo mode, appears to resemble the Vile Blood's crest in its lower register. This is almost certainly not accidental. Alfred hates the Vile Bloods with a singular obsession that defines his entire character arc. One reading of the armour detail is that he wore something bearing their symbol to remind himself of what he is fighting against, a kind of enemy iconography carried as a reminder. Another reading is darker and suggests the crest is there because Alfred was once closer to the Vile Bloods than his dialogue implies. His hate has the specific texture of someone who once admired what he now destroys. The Chalice dungeons contain enemy placements that are never replicated on the surface world, but use surface world character and environment assets in new configurations. Enemies that exist only underground in certain pairings suggest the dungeons are not just recycled content packaged differently, but a separate layer of the game world with its own internal logic that the surface cannot fully access or replicate. The Thumerian civilization that built the dungeons predates Yharnam, and the dungeon configurations reflect a different set of priorities, different ideas about what should be guarded, what should be preserved, and what should be kept from being seen by anyone who descends far enough. The message that appears when you die in Bloodborne, the two words "you died," uses a font that is slightly different from the font used in the rest of the game's UI. This is not unique to Bloodborne in the Soulsborne series, but the specific weight and spacing of the Bloodborne death screen font is thinner and more compressed than in the preceding games. Players who have done side-by-side comparisons describe it as appropriately fragile, which fits a game where the stakes of death feel personal in a way that is different from the stoic resilience implied by Dark Souls' version of the same message. The font is a design choice. Someone picked it for a reason. The Healing Church workshop contains a broken elevator that no longer functions. The shaft goes down further than the elevator would have travelled at its lowest recorded stop, and the depth is significant enough to notice. Players who have clipped through the floor of the shaft to descend further have found nothing, which is either a rendering limit or a deliberate emptiness. What is below that point is never addressed by any item description or NPC dialogue. The game introduced a physical space that extends beyond its own architecture and decided not to explain it. The depth of the shaft suggests whatever the elevator once served is a long way down. There is a note found in the research hall that uses a handwriting style different from every other note in the game. All other notes share a consistent cursive style that suggests a common educational background among the people who left them. This one is printed in careful block letters. The contents of that note describe a procedure that the other notes explicitly prohibit. Someone wrote it differently because they did not want it filed with the rest, or because they learned to write in a different place, or because they were recording something they did not want to be caught doing and were being careful. The block letters might be about disguise. The eye rune, which the player can equip to gain additional insight from certain actions, has a pupil that is not centered. In every iteration of the rune across all items and descriptions, the eye looks slightly to the left. No explanation is offered anywhere in the game for this asymmetry. The community has proposed that it is watching something the player cannot see, which fits with the general cosmological logic of Bloodborne, where awareness itself is an attractor for things that want to be known. An eye looking at something means something is there to be looked at. The Forbidden Woods village has a well at its centre that cannot be accessed. The geometry of the well allows players to look down into it, and the bottom is visible but empty except for a single item that sits just below the lip of the well's interior, in a way that makes it impossible to reach without a specific clipping exploit. The item, once retrieved through glitching, is a single pebble. The community interpretation of this varies widely, between a developer's genuine joke at the expense of determined players and an extremely bleak commentary on what happens when you investigate the things in Yharnam that feel like they should contain something important. Either reading works. The sound design in the Nightmare of Mensis includes a low-frequency hum that sits just below normal conversational audio range. Players who use headphones at normal listening volume report a persistent sense of discomfort in the ear during extended sessions in the area that they cannot attribute to any specific identifiable sound source until they check their audio settings and isolate the frequency. It is not quite subliminal, not quite below the threshold of perception, but it is also not audible the way a musical instrument is audible. It sits in the space between. From Software's audio team has spoken about using frequency design for emotional effect, and the Mensis hum appears to be one of their more precise applications of that approach. When the plain doll speaks to the player in the hunter's dream, she never uses the word hunter. She says you, she says dear, and she occasionally uses the player character's title in certain context-specific dialogues, but she never calls them a hunter directly as an identifier. Every other character in the game, from allied NPCs to enemies who recognize you, uses the word reflexively when addressing the player character. The doll's avoidance of it is either a writing oversight, which seems unlikely given how carefully the other dialogue is constructed, or it suggests she does not categorize the player the way the world of Yharnam does. She addresses something else in the person who stands in front of her. The Hunter's Nightmare shares its sky texture with the regular night sky over Yharnam, but the moon in the nightmare is rotated approximately 30 degrees clockwise from its position in the base game sky. If the moon visible in the game is a representation of the moon presence or is associated with its influence, then the nightmare's version of that same moon is tilted. Players who have tracked the moon's position across all areas of the game have confirmed the rotation is specific to the nightmare and does not appear in the standard Yharnam sky. One interpretation is that the moon presence behaves differently within the nightmare, where its influence is refracted through whatever mechanism maintains the hunter's nightmare as a separate space. There is a crow in the abandoned old workshop area that does not flee when the player approaches. Every other crow in the game, in every other location, takes flight at a set distance when the player comes close. This one holds its position, watching, until the player is close enough to walk directly through it, at which point it does finally take off. The distinction in behaviour from every other crow in the game is precise enough that it is not a programming error. One possible read is that it is not a real crow. Another is that it is a real crow, and it has seen enough in that location that a hunter walking toward it is not the most alarming thing it has witnessed there. The Cainhurst throne room has scuff marks on the floor, consistent with something heavy being dragged from the throne toward the main door. These marks are not replicated on the other side of the door, and they are not present anywhere else in the castle's floor textures. Whatever was dragged stopped before it left the room, or was put down before it reached the door, or was taken back to the throne before it got far enough to leave marks in the hall. The geometry of the marks is consistent with a large object, rather than a person being moved. What was on the throne that someone tried to move is not addressed by any lore text. The Moon Presence's design incorporates what appear to be human ribcage elements along its upper structure when viewed at close range. These are subtle enough that many players do not register them on a first viewing of the encounter. When they are pointed out in screenshots or annotated images, the reaction is usually discomfort, which appears to be exactly the intended effect. The Moon Presence is not entirely inhuman. There are components in its design that suggests it has consumed or absorbed something that had a ribcage, and the cage is now a visible structural element. The detail rewards attention and then makes you wish you had not paid it. The gargoyles on the Healing Church exterior are all facing inward toward the building, rather than outward. Traditional architectural gargoyles, in the Gothic tradition that Bloodborne's visual language heavily references, face outward to ward off evil from the building. Inward-facing gargoyles are a real historical variant associated with buildings whose occupants considered the exterior world more trustworthy than what was inside the structure. The Healing Church chose gargoyles that face inward. Whatever the church considered dangerous enough to watch, they positioned their stone guardians to watch for it inside, not outside. The music box that Gascoigne's daughter gives the player plays a tune that is a slowed-down, lower-register version of a lullaby that appears, in its full original tempo, during a hidden audio file not used in the released game. Dataminers found the full version years after launch. The released version is recognisably incomplete when you hear both versions, which you can now do on YouTube. The full lullaby is warmer and more functional as a piece of music. The slowed version in the game sounds like it is being played from memory, imperfectly, by something that only vaguely recalls what the tune was supposed to feel like. There is a version of the lecture building map that appears in the Hunter's Nightmare that has rooms labelled in the same way as the base game version. In the Nightmare version, however, the labels are in the wrong positions relative to the actual room layouts they are supposed to identify. Players who have compared the two versions room by room have confirmed that the labels do not match the spaces they are attached to in the Nightmare. One interpretation is that the map was printed before the building was finished, and the building was subsequently built differently from the plan. Another interpretation is that the Nightmare is showing the player a version of the building from a different point in its history, when the rooms served different purposes than they do now. The Bloodletter weapon has a unique idle animation when held in the right hand, where the hand occasionally flexes and then tightens slightly around the hilt during standing idle sequences. No other weapon in the game does this during idle. The Bloodletter is one of the only weapons in the game associated with self-inflicted harm as a core mechanic, and its lore connects it to a user who was gradually consumed by the blood it drew. The flexing in the idle animation might indicate reluctance building toward each use, or it might indicate compulsion building toward each use. Whether the hand is hesitating or preparing is something the animation does not resolve. Simon the Harrowed appears in two separate locations in the deal before arriving at his final position, and both of these earlier appearances can be missed entirely if the player moves through the areas quickly. The dialogue he gives in these earlier locations is entirely different from his final speech, and contains a direct reference to a character whose relationship to Simon is never made explicit in any item description, NPC dialogue, or environmental detail. The reference is clear enough that it is not a vague allusion. Simon knew someone, by name, and chose to mention them once in a location most players miss, without the game ever explaining who that person was. There is a painting in Cainhurst Castle that depicts a hunt in progress. The hunters in the painting wear a version of the hunter's garb that predates the version sold by the messengers, which suggests the painting is old enough to depict an earlier version of the hunter's uniform. The prey in the painting is ambiguous. It might be a beast of the kind the player fights on the streets of Yharnam. It might not be. The features visible in the painted prey are consistent with either interpretation. Whoever commissioned the painting may have wanted the ambiguity. The elevator in the Healing Church main building has a weight limit indicator etched into the floor inside the cab that is easy to miss while simply using the elevator to travel. The indicator marks a weight significantly higher than any single enemy or character in the game could plausibly be based on their physical dimensions and the density of their known material composition. Whatever the elevator was originally built to carry was not a human being and was not the typical size of the creatures found in the area around it. The elevator was modified for human use, or was always too large for the thing it was supposed to serve. When the player character bows to the plain doll, which is a player-initiated action, using an emote, the doll returns the bow after a slight delay that is consistent with a person noticing they are being addressed, rather than a programmed immediate response. What community members noticed on close observation is that her return bow is consistently slightly deeper than the bow the player initiates. In formal Japanese social contexts, a deeper return bow indicates respect toward the person being addressed and signals higher social regard rather than subservience. The doll is not bowing because she is below the player. She is bowing because she considers the player worth bowing more deeply for. There is a set of iron rings bolted to the floor of the Yharnam chapel that serves no obvious gameplay function. They are at a spacing and ring diameter that is consistent with being anchor points for restraints capable of holding a large adult. The chapel is associated with the school of Mensis and their practice of capturing people and exposing them to the nightmare. The iron rings might simply be part of a broader design language meant to communicate the space's function as a place where things were done to people without their consent. Or the rings were load-bearing furniture for a specific procedure the game does not illustrate in detail. The choir enemy type found in the upper cathedral ward has a subtle shimmer to their robes that does not appear on other cloth-wearing enemies in the game when examined in comparable lighting conditions. The shimmer is consistent with a material property that in the game's lighting engine is associated with objects that emit low-level light of their own rather than reflecting environmental light. The choir robes are faintly bioluminescent. This would indicate the choir members underwent a physical transformation consistent with the upper cathedral ward's themes, without their robes being listed as a transformed item anywhere in the lore. Jura's accent in the English localization is noticeably different from every other character in the game. All other characters share a broadly consistent regional accent that suggests a common origin within Yharnam or its immediate surroundings. Jura sounds like he came from somewhere else, and the specific dialect chosen by the voice actor places his origin at a geographical remove from Yharnam. His lore confirms obliquely that he has been in Old Yharnam long enough for the city to change around him, but never states where he came from before. The accent is the only surviving evidence of an origin the game chose not to address in writing. The Pthumerian descendant enemy found in the Chalice dungeons mirrors the player's dodge timing more accurately than any surface enemy in the game. Data miners who have examined the enemy's code have confirmed that the dodge detection window for this specific enemy is calibrated against the player's movement frame data in a way that other enemies are not. Other enemies react to the player's current animation. The Pthumerian descendant appears to be predicting the player's next input based on the pattern of their last several inputs. It is the closest thing Bloodborne has to an enemy that learns during the fight. There is a bloodstain in the area just before the Murgo's Wet Nurse boss room that, when triggered, shows a player character dying while standing completely still, with no attack animation accompanying the death. The bloodstain uses the falling damage death animation. The location of the bloodstain is flat ground with no drops nearby. Players who have examined the death record believe the player whose death this records was somehow thrown or launched by something that is not visible in the immediate area when the bloodstain is triggered. Whatever caused the death is either gone or not something the game renders for other players. The item description for the sedative states that it calms the nerves. Every other restorative item in the game describes either a physical process of healing or a material being consumed. The sedative describes an effect on the nervous system rather than a physical process. This distinction in writing style has led some players to suggest the sedative operates through a mechanism different from the blood-based restoration that governs everything else in the game. Its calming effect is nervous rather than physical. Given that frenzy, the status effect the sedative cures, is associated with exposure to the cosmos and the accumulation of insight. A calming agent that works on the mind specifically makes sense in ways that a blood-based cure might not. The plain doll's eyes track the camera during certain emotes performed near her, but not during others. The tracking appears to activate for emotes that involve looking towards something, including the bow, the point gesture, and certain forms of the beckoning gesture. It does not activate for emotes that involve turning away or looking down. The behavioural distinction is consistent with the doll paying attention to what she is being shown or asked to look at, and not tracking what she is not being invited to see. She is watching what the player invites her to look at. She respects the direction of attention. When the player enters the lecture building for the first time, a clock on the wall shows a time of approximately 3:42. The same clock in the Hunter's Nightmare version of the building shows a different time. Players who have timed their runs to enter the building at specific in-game hours have confirmed that the clock does not reflect actual elapsed game time. It was set at a specific moment and never updated. The moment it was set reflects when someone last wounded it or set its hands, which would have been a specific event during the game's history. The two versions of the building show different moments in that history. There is an oil drum in central Yharnam positioned at the top of a short drop that would deal minor fall damage if the player fell onto it from the vantage point above it. The drum itself deals no damage on contact. The community has proposed that it was placed there as a visual decoy to make players hesitate at the edge of the drop, buying time for the enemy below to be ready, or for the player to find the ladder nearby. The drum works as a deterrent whether or not the design intent was explicit. Players slow down at the sight of it. It achieves the effect. The final boss of the base game, Yharnam, has a lunge attack that can be interrupted by throwing a pebble at him during the wind-up. This is technically a mechanic available to any player who knows about it, and has a pebble equipped in their quickbar. The hitbox on the pebble throw during the lunge wind-up is precise enough that it requires deliberate aim, and the timing is precise enough that it requires familiarity with the attack pattern. It appears in no official documentation. It is visible in advanced community speedrun resources. It exists because the physics engine allowed it to exist, and no designer removed it before release. The Winter Lantern enemy produces a sound effect that at sufficient volume contains a recognizable, pitched harmonic element underneath the more obvious noise. Music theory enthusiasts in the community have identified the underlying pitch as a tritone interval, which was historically called diabolus in musica in medieval musical theory, meaning the devil in music. The tritone was specifically avoided in sacred music because of its perceived dissonance and was associated with instability and danger. The Winter Lantern hums it continuously. Frenzy builds when you hear it. The association is either extremely deliberate or an impressively aligned accident. The Hunter Chief emblem key item has an engraving on its reverse side that is not visible during normal gameplay because the item viewer does not allow full rotation. Players who accessed the item model through the game files found text on the reverse in a damaged state that reads as a partial phrase which, when completed by community consensus, roughly translates to something like, "Let none pass who have not bled for the city." This phrase appears nowhere in the game's dialogue, item descriptions, or environmental writing. It was placed on the back of a key item in a location no player could reach during normal play, and it reads like the motto of an institution that no longer exists. The doll is made of porcelain, which fractures under significant stress in ways that metal or organic materials do not. Players have attempted to kill the doll in the hunter's dream using every available weapon and combination of weapons. She cannot be killed by any standard means. She drops to a single health point and stops taking damage regardless of what is applied after that threshold. She does not retaliate. She stands at 1 health point and remains there. The community has not reached consensus on what this means about her nature. She can be reduced to the edge of breaking, and she stays there, which is either mercy or architecture. The loading screen tips in Bloodborne contain one tip that references a mechanic that does not exist in the released version of the game. The tip describes a system for marking specific enemies for later engagement in a way that would carry over between area visits. No such marking system exists in the finished product, and the tip was never removed from the loading screen pool, despite other tips being updated in patches. The tip plays normally during loading screens alongside functional gameplay advice. It describes a ghost mechanic in the same voice as real ones. Chapter 2. Letters the game never sent. The note, found beside the first insight merchant in the game, describes a woman who wept blood rather than tears and was brought to the healing church for examination. The note is brief and clinical, and the examination it describes sounds routine given the context of the church's known practices. No NPC in the game fits this description exactly, and no follow-up note describes the outcome of the examination. The note ends mid-sentence, suggesting either that the person writing it was interrupted or that they stopped before completing a thought they had decided not to finish. The woman in the note has no name and no known fate in the lore. There is a version of Gascoigne's beast form, whose raw animation, when viewed frame by frame through the game's files or captured at high frame rate, reveals a split second of the standard human grief animation playing underneath the beast's raw sequence. The beast model transitions through a grief expression before completing the raw. This is almost certainly a transition artifact from the animation blending system rather than an intentional design choice, but it lands with a particular weight given the character's backstory. Gascoigne, who entered the hunt grieving and who could not stop killing even those he loved, roars like an animal through a face that briefly shows something human underneath. The Nightmare Frontier contains an invisible wall that prevents the player from reaching an area that is visually accessible from the normal path. The geometry behind the wall is fully rendered, including grass, rocks, and what appears to be a path that continues past the barrier. Players who have reached the area through clipping exploits report that the path is real but leads to nothing, an area of terrain that was built and then closed off. The wall was placed not to contain something in the accessible area, but to prevent the player from seeing that there was nothing behind it. Adela the Nun's dialogue changes slightly, depending on the order in which the player has completed or progressed through other NPC questlines in the game. In one variant, she makes a reference to a hunter who came before the player and says they reminded her of someone who had helped her when she was afraid. In another variant, she has no such memory and meets the player as if for the first time with no prior reference point. The variant with the memory of a previous helper suggests a prior protagonist whose actions left traces, which is consistent with the game's implied cyclical structure, but it is also the variant most players in a first playthrough never see. The Chalice dungeon naming convention uses a combination of regional adjective and location type that in most cases corresponds to the dungeon's dominant enemy faction or architectural period. There is one dungeon type where the name suggests a faction that does not appear as active enemies anywhere within that dungeon's generated rooms. The faction referenced in the title appears in item descriptions connected to events that predate the dungeon's construction and never appears as a spawnable enemy anywhere in the game. The dungeon is named for something that no longer exists within it, and perhaps never existed within the structure the player explores. The bridge in the Forbidden Woods, connecting the main path to the optional cave area, has a structural inconsistency in its stonework. One half of the bridge uses weathered old stone with a texture consistent with the ancient construction visible in the deeper sections of the woods. The other half uses stone with a fresher, more consistent texture that matches the newer areas of the region. The join between the two halves is visible when the player stands on the bridge and looks down at the surface. Someone repaired half the bridge and left the original half standing. The game does not indicate who did the repair or why only half required it. Mikolash's final words before his second encounter in the Nightmare of Mensis include a reference to something that ascends, something he believes is coming up toward him from below. In the original Japanese version of the game, the word used for the ascending movement is a specific grammatical form that implies rising from a lower register or elevation rather than simply rising from a flat surface. The entity or phenomenon Mikolash describes is coming up from somewhere lower. The translation choices in the English localization handle this differently from other localizations, and the distinctions matter if you are trying to understand what Mikolash believes is happening in the space beneath where he stands. There is a painting in the lecture building that depicts a city that is not Yharnam. The architecture visible in the painting uses pointed arches and tower configurations that do not match any structure in Yharnam, and the scale of the figures depicted relative to the buildings suggests the city is significantly larger. The sky in the painting is painted a pale grey rather than the deep blue or black of Yharnam's usual setting. The painting has no label, title card, or identifying text anywhere near it. Community members have proposed several real-world architectural references and in-game location candidates as the source of the depicted city, and none of these proposals has been confirmed or refuted by any official source. The Forbidden Woods contains an area where the player can find evidence of a campsite that was hastily abandoned. Embers are present, but cold. Belongings are scattered rather than packed. A lantern is lying on its side rather than hung or stood upright. The signs suggest the person at the camp left in a hurry without taking anything or organising anything first. No enemy spawns in the immediate vicinity of the campsite. Whatever the person at the camp was fleeing was not a snake enemy, or maniata boar, or any creature the game places in that area. They fled something that the game does not place there. The health bar of the celestial emissary's many small forms does not deplete when those forms are killed during the encounter. Players who specifically target the small forms and kill as many as possible before engaging the large central form have confirmed that the health bar belonging to the encounter does not decrease with each small form death. The health bar belongs exclusively to the large form. The small ones can be killed indefinitely, and they will keep appearing. The encounter's health belongs to one thing. Everything else is incidental to that one thing. The choir's upper cathedral ward contains a writing desk with papers on it that can be approached and examined from a distance, but cannot be read through any normal gameplay interaction. The papers are rendered with sufficient detail to show that they contain text in a uniform hand. Players who have captured the scene at the highest available resolution and examined the resulting image report that the visible characters are consistent with the game's in-universe decorative script, rather than with placeholder lorem ipsum or repeated symbol patterns. Someone wrote something on those papers before the scene was finalized. The writing is real. The content is inaccessible. There is an enemy in the research hall who follows a patrol route that takes it directly to a locked door on one wall of its patrol area. When it reaches the door, it stops, faces it for several seconds, and then turns and returns the way it came. This pause is not shared by any other patrol enemy in the game. The door it faces cannot be opened by any key or mechanism available to the player. The enemy performs this action whether the player is in the room or not. Community members have watched the behaviour from hidden angles in the room to confirm it is not triggered by the player's presence. The enemy is not checking the door because of the player. It checks the door every cycle. The impurity rune associated with Alfred and the executioners has a slightly different ink saturation level, depending on which version of it the player equips from the available variants. Visually, the variants appear nearly identical under normal gameplay conditions, but players who have compared them in photo mode under controlled lighting have confirmed the saturation difference is real and consistent across platforms. The item descriptions for the different versions do not acknowledge any difference between them. The difference exists in the art and not in the text, as if the impurity of the variants was expressed without being named. The sound of the bell that the messenger maidens ring when facilitating co-op summoning or invasion connections contains a frequency that overlaps with the frequency used in the game's ambient audio for the insight gain effect. The two sounds are not the same, and they are not derived from the same audio file. They share enough of a harmonic range that the bell's tone produces a faint residual echo of the insight chime in the same audio space. Players who listen for it with headphones in a quiet environment report that ringing the bell produces a ghost of the insight sound underneath it. Whether this is intentional audio design or a coincidence of the harmonic space both sounds occupy is not established. The Beast Claw weapon's transform attack animation, the sequence of motions the player character performs when switching from the normal mode to the transformed mode, briefly passes through a position where the hand is fully splayed open, with the palm facing outward and slightly upward. This position appears in no other weapon animation in the game. Community members with martial arts backgrounds have noted that the specific position resembles an opening stance associated with grapple-based fighting styles. The Beast Claw does not have a grapple or throw move in the released game. The stance is present in the animation as a remnant of something that was planned and then removed or simplified. Eileen the Crow's dialogue near the conclusion of her questline, in the context where her arc resolves positively, contains the phrase, "I hope you find what you are looking for," in a delivery that does not carry the warmth the words themselves suggest. The line reads, in its audio performance, more like a warning than a well-wish. Community members have split on this reading, with some arguing it is genuine goodwill from a character who has seen enough to know how these things go, and others arguing it is Eileen acknowledging that the player's goals and the player's actual situation are not aligned. She hopes you find what you want. She is not sure what you will find instead. The orphan of Koz's body, when the encounter ends, falls into the water of the shoreline and does not leave a visible corpse. Most boss enemies in the game leave a body or at least a partial model after death. The orphan's body sinks, and players who have accessed the water geometry through clipping exploits have found no submerged body model waiting at the bottom. The game removes the orphan's body from the scene entirely on death, unlike any other boss in the game. Whatever the orphan was, where its body goes is not a question the game allows to have a visual answer. There is a door in Old Yharnam that opens from the inside only. The door's handle and mechanism are on the interior side, and the exterior has no corresponding handle or visible latch. The door cannot be opened by the player from the outside by any interaction available in the game. It can be opened by the game itself. Speedrunners and sequence breakers who have manipulated the zone loading and trigger order have observed the door in a briefly open state during certain loading transitions. The room on the other side of the door is not accessible by any method that preserves the game in a stable state. The Hypergean Gaol area is accessible via a trap on the Yharnam streets, and the trap's animation includes a very brief transition before the underground location fully loads. During those transitional frames, players using capture hardware and frame-by-frame analysis have identified a sky visible in the transition that is not the regular night sky of Yharnam and not the sky of Yahargul proper. It is a pale grey that is consistent with pre-dawn rather than night, or the specific crimson of the nightmare areas. The transition sky appears for approximately 4 frames and disappears before the area loads fully. The place the trap takes you through exists somewhere between locations. The item description for the pebble identifies it as the most basic available weapon equivalent in the game and describes its primary uses in simple functional terms. What the description does not mention is that the pebble triggers several environmental reactions and puzzle interactions in the game world that no other throwable item replicates. Community testers have confirmed at least 6 distinct environmental interactions that are exclusive to the pebble. Items that have no business being complex or interesting turn out to be broadly interactive in ways the game never surfaces. The pebble is described as the least interesting item and behaves as one of the most interactive ones. The Workshop Haze Extractor tool item has a bloodstain present on it when the player first picks it up, before the tool has been used for any in-game purpose. The stain pattern is not consistent with the tool's stated chemical extraction function. The pattern is consistent with the tool having been used as a blunt instrument, held at one end and swung at something that was close. The tool's stated function is chemical and requires no striking force. The prior use of the tool, whatever left the blood, was different from its described purpose. It was used as a weapon before the player found it. The Cainhurst letter that Queen Annalise references in her dialogue implies a correspondence between Cainhurst and the Healing Church that has been ongoing for several generations before the events of the game. If the letter's implications are taken at face value, Annalise has been receiving communications from a church that has openly attempted to destroy her lineage and continues to respond to those communications. She keeps writing back her continued engagement with a correspondent that has tried to kill her, and her line carries a patience that reads either as genuine hope that the church will eventually change its position or as something more strategic. Either interpretation requires her to believe the correspondence serves a purpose. There is a chain hanging from the ceiling in the Hunter's Nightmare version of the lecture building that has no corresponding element in the base game version of the same space. The chain is attached to nothing visible at the ceiling and nothing visible at the level where it ends, floating in free space. Community proposals have included a cut mechanical element, a cut enemy, or a structural point in the Nightmare's architecture that was simplified during development. The chain hangs in a room that is otherwise consistent between the two versions of the building. The ceiling attachment point, if there is one, is above the visible render distance. The first enemy the player faces in the game, the werewolf in the clinic alley immediately after character creation, has attack damage values that are calibrated to kill the player character in approximately 3 hits, regardless of which starting class was chosen. The calibration holds across the health value differences between starting classes. This was a deliberate design choice, confirmed by the consistent application across all class starting values. The game's first enemy was designed to kill you specifically. The learning intended by the death sequence cannot happen unless you actually die. Which means the first enemy was built to ensure that outcome before the player knows enough to prevent it. When the player receives a unique gesture from an NPC and then performs that gesture near a different NPC, some characters respond with recognition or a reaction specific to that gesture in that context. Most NPCs do not react. The ones who do react share either a faction or a personal connection with the NPC who originally taught the gesture. The recognition is a social graph embedded in gesture interactions. It is a network of relationships the game maps through an optional mechanic that no tutorial ever surfaces. Players who have systematically tested gesture interactions with all available NPCs have documented the full graph. The sky over the Nightmare of Mensis contains a moon that is too large to be credible at any physically real distance from the ground. Players who have compared the moon's apparent size in the Nightmare to the moon's apparent size in the standard Yharnam sky have estimated that the Nightmare's moon is approximately 4 times larger at the same implied atmospheric distance. The size can be explained by either proximity or simply size. If the nightmare's moon is the moon presence or its physical manifestation, then the nightmare is a space where the moon presence is closer than it ever appears anywhere else in the game. There is a specific variation of the Healing Church music box sound that occurs when the player has the Mensis cage equipped in their head slot before activating the box. The variation is subtle in the change it makes to the played tune, and it went undetected for a significant period after launch. Community members eventually confirmed its existence through controlled testing. The Mensis cage is an item associated with the School of Mensis and their attempts to contact the nightmare. The music box is associated with a specific memory of grief. The two items in combination produce a different sound from either alone. The Fishing Hamlet's dock area has fishing nets along the posts and beams that contain objects that are not fish. Players who have stood close to the nets and examined their contents in photo mode at maximum zoom have confirmed that the shapes inside the nets are roughly consistent with smaller versions of the Kos parasite model. They are oriented upward, as if they were swimming toward the surface when they were caught, and could not reverse direction. The nets were set, and the things that ended up in them were not the things the nets were intended for. Patches the Spider's dialogue contains an account of events that does not align with the timeline implied by the other NPCs in his vicinity, and the environmental information in the areas he occupies. Either Patches is lying, which is strongly consistent with the character's presentation and with his equivalents in other From Software games, or he experienced his sequence of events in a genuinely different order. The discrepancy in his account is specific enough to identify, which means if it is a lie, it is a precisely constructed one. If it is not a lie, the question of how it differs from the timeline other characters support is one the game leaves unanswered. The Lunarium key that opens the Lunarium in the choir area has a keyring with 3 additional keys attached to it that serve no function in the released game. The 3 additional keys have distinct geometries visible in the item model. None of those geometries matches any door or lock present in the accessible game world. Data miners have found no corresponding lock or door geometry in the game files that matches the 3 additional keys. The keys exist in the model, they are attached to a functional key, and they open nothing. 3 areas were planned and either removed entirely or moved to parts of the game that the player cannot reach. The doll's knitting, which she performs in idle animation sequences during time the player spends in the hunter's dream without interacting with her, produces an object that is never shown in a completed state. Players who have remained in the hunter's dream for extended periods without interacting with the doll have watched her knitting cycles and never observed the object reaching completion. She is always in the process of making something. What she is making, how large it is, and how far along it is at any given point have all been discussed in community threads. The consensus is that the unfinished object is a deliberate choice rather than an animation limitation. There is a lantern in one of the Thumerian Chalice dungeons that flickers in a pattern different from all other lanterns in the game. Most lantern effects in the game are procedural, producing a natural-looking but unstructured flicker. This lantern's flicker pattern is non-random and repeating. It has been analysed by community members who study the dungeon as directional signalling, a 3-flicker, pause, single flicker sequence that points a specific direction. A lantern is positioned at an intersection of 3 corridors. Players who have followed the direction indicated by the pattern have consistently found the best room at that junction end of the indicated corridor. Someone left a working signal in the deepest part of the chalice system. The item description for the cold blood flowerbud states it grows in cold places where blood has been spilled in large quantities over a long time. The plant's largest cluster in the game is found in the Hunter's Nightmare, which satisfies both conditions of the description. The item text also contains a clause, easy to read past, that suggests the plant may bloom before a blood spill rather than in response to one. If this clause is taken as law rather than poetic description, the cold blood flowerbud is a predictor of violence. It flowers in advance of the blood that will eventually feed it. The nightmare is covered in blooms. When the game's credits play, the music accompanying them contains a vocal element that appears in no other piece of the game's soundtrack. The game's credited musical performers and vocalists are listed in the accompanying documentation, and the vocal element that appears during the credits is not attributed to any of the listed names. Players who have isolated the vocal audio from the credit sequence describe it as a child's voice, performing something that is not quite melody and not quite speech. Whether the vocal was recorded specifically for the credits or was extracted from another source and repurposed has not been established. The Bloodborne trophy, earned by completing Eileen the Crow's questline, is titled with a word that in Old English carries two distinct meanings. The primary meaning relates to crows and is the obvious reading given the character involved. The secondary meaning relates to inheritance or succession within a line of obligation. The secondary meaning, applied to the questline's resolution, implies that Eileen is not simply passing on a role to another hunter. She is passing on a debt. Whatever obligation the crow hunters carry, it is not a job. It is something owed. Mikolash's cage configuration, the furniture and arrangement of the space he occupies before and during the boss encounter, is not unique to his location in the nightmare. There is a second, identical arrangement 2 floors below his boss arena, in a room accessible through the nightmare's architecture. The second cage room contains a desk with papers, a chair placed at a specific angle, and the same spatial configuration as the one Mikolash uses. It is empty of any occupant or notable item. Someone else had the same setup, whether they used it for the same purposes or whether the purposes changed between occupants is not described anywhere in the game. The shortcut door in Cathedral Ward that an allied NPC opens for the player near the end of a questline is opened by the NPC from the interior side of the door. The NPC had to already be on the interior side. At no visible point in the questline preceding this moment is there a clear path that would have taken the NPC from their starting location to the interior side of that door. The route that would have gotten them there passes through areas that the NPC should not have been able to access given what has happened in those areas by that point in the game. The NPC is behind a door they should not have been able to reach, and the game does not explain how they got there. The blood vials the player uses to heal are described in item text as containing the blood of others, processed and refined for use as medicine in a context where the Healing Church's blood ministration is the dominant medical practice. The starting blood vial in the player's inventory at the beginning of the game is not marked differently from any other blood vial in any accessible item property. It has the same description, the same value, and the same effect as every vial the player finds or purchases afterward. The player character begins the game already having consumed someone else's blood, and this happens before they are aware enough of the implications to have chosen it. The contract was already signed. Chapter 3. The ones you almost missed in the Forbidden Woods. There is a house at the end of a side path that has been sealed from the inside by furniture placed against the interior walls and door. Through a gap in the boards blocking a window, the player can see furniture arranged to face a single central point on the floor of the room's main space. No bodies are visible inside. No enemy occupies the house. Whatever made the arrangement, and whatever the arrangement was meant to contain or to watch, has either left or is not something the game renders as visible. The furniture faces the centre of the room with the kind of intentionality that suggests the arrangement had a purpose. The centre point is empty. The snakeball enemy, which appears as a rolling mass of serpents in the Forbidden Woods, has individual snakes within its combined body that each have separate health values in the game's code. Killing the snakeball as a unit does not necessarily reduce the health of any individual snake to 0. Players who have used the correct attack types in the correct sequence to separate individual snakes from the ball before the ball's own health bar depletes find that each separated snake behaves as its own entity. The ball's roll speed also decreases as individual snakes are removed. This mechanic is not explained anywhere in the game and is not intuitive based on how the enemy presents itself visually. There is a version of the Hunter's Mark rune that, under specific lighting conditions within the Hunter's Dream environment, casts a shadow that differs from the physical rune shape. The shadow appears to have an additional line element that is not present in the rune's visible geometry. Players who have documented this in multiple screenshots describe the additional shadow line as a small, horizontal bar through the upper arc of the rune. This modification to the shape produces something closer to a negation or cancel symbol in the context of European graphical tradition. The rune, when it casts a shadow, appears to mark its own cancellation. The cleric beast's collar is visible during the encounter for players who look for it rather than focusing entirely on the combat. Collars of its specific design type in the Victorian-era cultural aesthetic that Bloodborne draws on heavily were associated with domesticated animals rather than wild ones. Wild animals were not collared. The cleric beast was kept by someone before the events of the game. Its current state as the creature the player fights first is not its original state. It was domesticated and then became what the player encounters. The collar is the only surviving evidence of what it was before. The password used to speak with Iosefka through her clinic gate on a second playthrough, after the character behind the door has changed from the original NPC, is identical to the password used on the first playthrough. The gate, the password, and the voice that responds from behind the door are all continuous. Whoever is behind the door on the second visit uses the same password that the original Iosefka established. Given that the situation inside the clinic changes dramatically between the two visits, the maintenance of the same password is either an oversight or a character detail. The person behind the door, whoever they are by the second visit, believes the same protocols still apply. The model for the amygdala enemy contains internal geometry that becomes briefly visible through the outer shell of the creature when the player stands in specific positions relative to a strong light source. This geometry is not normally rendered and requires specific lighting and camera angles to observe. Community members who have documented the internal geometry describe it as a simplified human skeleton in a curled fetal position. The amygdala, one of the great ones visible in the world with sufficient insight, appears to contain a human body inside its frame. Whether the body was incorporated into the amygdala's structure, or whether the amygdala grew around something human is not addressed in any lore text. There is a message written on the research hall floor in dried blood that reads, "Don't look up." The message is at a point in the architecture where the ceiling above the player contains an interactive hazard requiring upward attention to navigate. The message is accurate as practical advice. However, the game continues regardless of whether the player follows the advice. Players who read the message and choose not to look up still face the hazard. The message is not wrong. It is telling the truth about what happens if you look up and implying nothing about what happens if you follow the advice. It is complete as written. The Vicar Amelia boss fight includes a moment during a specific phase transition where the boss stops moving entirely, lowers its head, and holds the position for several seconds. This pause is fully visible and occurs at a reliable point in the encounter for every player. During the pause, Amelia is fully vulnerable and takes increased damage from all attack types, confirmed through data means damage multiplier values. The moment looks like prayer. The boss is praying during a boss fight. The game does not flag this as a special window, does not prompt the player to take advantage of it, and does not explain why it occurs. There is a section of the central Yharnam sewer system that contains no enemies in any configuration of the playthrough. It is the only fully enemy-free area within the early game, and nothing about the level design draws the player's attention toward it. Players who explore it find a single item placed in the middle of the empty passage, positioned as if someone set it down deliberately in the centre of the floor rather than leaving it casually. The item is a twin bloodstone shard, which is useful for early weapon upgrades, but is not rare enough to justify the care of its presentation. The care is more intentional than the reward. The Powder Kegs Factions Workshop, referenced in lore and partially accessible through connected areas, contains tools with profiles that do not match any weapon or item in the player's accessible inventory. The tool shapes are for maintaining something that is not in the game. Data miners have found partial mesh data for a weapon type that matches the profiles of the maintenance tools in question, but the weapon was removed from the release version before the game shipped. The tools for it remained in the environment. The workshop maintains something the player cannot use and the player cannot see. When the plain doll cries, which she does in at least one dialogue context, the tears she produces are not rendered using the standard particle effects system used for water and precipitation in the game. They use the same material shader as blood effects. The distinction is visible in photo mode and has been confirmed through screenshot comparison by community members. In a game where the central substance is blood, and where the doll's tears are mechanically blood, the question of what the doll is made of in a substantive sense goes beyond the porcelain of her physical form. There is a chalice dungeon room that contains a treasure chest positioned in the exact centre of a pressure plate. The pressure plate triggers a mechanism that locks the room's exit door when weight is applied to it. The chest contains nothing. Every other treasure chest in the Chalice dungeons contains at least one item. This one is empty. The room has no enemies. Activating the pressure plate by opening the chest locks the player in an empty room. The door can be broken down after a period of sustained effort, but this takes time. The room was designed to make the player feel foolish, to confirm that the trap was sprung, and then to let them leave. The Research Hall patients who have undergone advanced transformation exhibit behavioural patterns suggesting they retain partial awareness even after the physical changes have progressed significantly. One patient in particular, noted by community members for this behaviour, follows the player's movement with her face, while her body continues along the standard enemy patrol animation. The facial tracking and the body movement are on different animation layers and are not synchronized. Her face is watching the player. Her body does not register the player's presence. Whatever she was, the part of her that watches is still operating. Alfred's signature gesture, a single hand raised with fingers spread in a specific benediction-like position, appears in a painting inside the Canehurst throne room. The painting depicts an executioner in what appears to be a historical scene, based on the style of dress and the painting's aged appearance. Alfred performs the same gesture during his own questline as a personal expression. Either the gesture is traditional to the executioner order, and Alfred inherited it along with the role and philosophy, or the painting depicts Alfred himself in a setting that is inconsistent with the timeline the game implies. The shortcut near the cleric beast lantern that opens via a lever mechanism reduces travel time between the lantern and the lower areas of central Yharnam by approximately 45 seconds at average walking speed. The lever can only be operated from the lantern side of the gate. The gate does not have a lever or mechanism on the other side. The shortcut is one-directional, opening from the side with the lantern and providing no means of operation from the other side. Someone on the lantern side opened the gate for the player. That person is not identified, and there is no NPC in the area whose presence at the lever is explained. When players remain in the hunter's dream for extended periods without any input, the ambient music shifts gradually over the course of approximately 15 minutes of real time. The shift is not abrupt and is difficult to identify as it is happening. By the end of the shift, the music has moved from its standard key and melodic structure into a harmonic territory closely associated with the Moon Presence themes used in the late-game soundtrack. The dream's music, given enough time and enough stillness, moves toward the Moon Presence's influence, without any visible event triggering the change. The dream is not static when the player is idle. It moves towards something. The enemy called the Living Failures is named for a state of incompletion rather than a state of error. They are not experiments that went wrong in the sense of producing a bad outcome. They are experiments that did not complete, that stopped before the intended transformation finished. The name Living Failures does not describe failure as a judgment. It describes an ongoing state of being not yet finished. The encounter ends when they are killed, but the fight itself shows creatures that are still attempting something and are still being prevented from completing it. They are failing in present tense every moment of the fight. There is a gravestone in the hunter's dream that bears no inscription. Every other gravestone in the dream has at least a partial inscription visible on at least one face. This one is blank on all 4 visible sides. Players who examined the audio file system for triggers connected to the blank gravestone's location found a single audio file assigned to that location. The file contains silence. Not the silence of an absent sound, but an audio file that exists and contains nothing. The empty gravestone has a corresponding piece of audio, and the audio is silence. The silence is assigned intentionally. The fishing hamlet NPCs use a word for the hunters in their Japanese dialogue that carries different connotations from the word used for hunters in every other area of the game. The standard Japanese word for hunter used in Yharnam and the affiliated areas suggests professional pursuit within an established system. The hamlet's word is closer to raider, or those who arrive and take. The distinction captures a genuine difference in how the hamlet's occupants understand what hunters do, which is relevant to the DLC's themes. The localization team chose not to differentiate the words in the English version, which is a defensible call but loses a layer of meaning that is visible to players in the original. The celestial emissaries' smaller forms, the many little blue-skinned creatures that accompany the large central form during the encounter, emit a sound that community members have run through spectral analysis software. The spectrogram of the emitted sound produces a visual pattern that community members have compared to the eye rune. The resemblance is approximate rather than exact, but it has been noted independently in multiple community posts and discussions. The emissary is associated with the cosmos and with vision as a cosmic concept, and the sound it makes shapes into the rune for vision when visualized. The clock tower in Yharnam shows a time of approximately 3:15 when stopped. Other stopped clocks in the game show different times from each other. If the clocks were all halted by the same event occurring simultaneously, they would show the same time. They do not. Either the clocks were stopped by different events occurring at different moments, or they were set to different times deliberately after they stopped working normally. Either interpretation suggests the history of stopping in Yharnam is more complicated than a single event. There is an echo effect applied to the player's footstep audio in the Hunter's Nightmare that is not applied in any other area of the game. The echo can be detected through headphone listening and confirmed through audio analysis. The echo is consistent with the footstep sounds reflecting off surfaces that are further away than the visible geometry of the nightmare would suggest. The nightmare's space is wider than it appears. There is room in the nightmare that the player never reaches, and the audio reflects it. The Thumerian Elder's staff has a crack in its shaft that is visible when the item model is examined closely, either through photo mode or through file access, but is not visible during the actual boss encounter due to the rendering distance at which the encounter typically takes place. The crack begins near the head of the staff and extends along the shaft in a direction consistent with stress fracture patterns. The Elder uses the staff with full force in multiple attacks. Either the crack is purely cosmetic and the staff is structurally sound, or the staff has partially failed and continues to function against the odds. The Vile Blood Register, which logs all Vile Blood hunters encountered, contains exactly one entry when the player first picks it up. The entry is not the player character's name. It is a name that does not correspond to any named NPC in the game's dialogue, item descriptions, or environmental text. The register was in use before the player arrived, and someone registered before the player did. Community members have proposed that the name belongs to a cut character, a developer name, or a player from a previous cycle of the hunt. None of these proposals has been confirmed. There is a door in Cainhurst Castle that is partially open. The gap between the door and the frame is wide enough to see into the room beyond. The room behind the door contains a writing table of small dimensions, a chair of proportionally small size, and what appears to be a writing implement on the table. Cainhurst's lore focuses entirely on adult nobility, the vile bloods, and adult conflict. There are no children in the active narrative of the castle. The small furniture is there, and it is not explained by any lore text. The snake cult village in the Forbidden Woods contains a central fire that does not extinguish over time. Enemy campfires in other areas of the game extinguish after the area has been cleared of enemies for a sufficient period. The snake cult fire remains lit, regardless of how long the player waits, regardless of whether enemies are present, and regardless of the area's state. Something maintains the fire, or the fire has a self-sustaining property that other fires in the game do not share. The snake cult's central flame does not go out. When the player kills Father Gascoigne in beast form and then interacts with his daughter through the window, the conversation plays normally. If the player has specifically told the daughter her father is dead before the encounter and then kills Gascoigne and then returns to speak with the daughter again, a third dialogue variant triggers that is one line longer than the other two available variants. Community members who have triggered this variant have compared it carefully to the others. The additional line involves the daughter saying something that the other two variants do not give her the chance to say. The third variant requires the player to have given her the worst news before taking the source of it from her. There is a physical note prop in Hemwick Charnel Lane that shows text at high resolution, and the text displayed when the player reads the note through the game's reading interface is not the same. The prop, at maximum zoom in photo mode, shows one word in a key sentence. The display text shows a near synonym in the same position. The two words are close in meaning, but one implies an active awareness and the other implies an automatic or compelled behaviour. The difference changes the reading of what the Hemwick Grave women are doing and whether they know they are doing it. The lower level brain in the Nightmare of Mensis, which the player can interact with using the make contact gesture to receive an insight reward, grants that reward before the player performs the gesture if the player enters the room facing away from the brain's location. Players who back into the room with the camera oriented away from the brain receive the insight grant at the room's threshold before the game's standard trigger for the gesture interaction registers. The game is granting insight for proximity to something the player has not yet faced. Insight accumulates before you turn toward what gives it to you. The workshop mould in the abandoned old workshop is the same dimensions as the plain doll in the Hunter's Dream. The mould is cracked and old and clearly not in recent use. The implication is that the doll was created from a mould in the abandoned workshop, which is the oldest Hunter workspace in the game's history. The doll's behaviour and apparent awareness exceed the parameters of what any described creation process in the lore is supposed to produce. Either the doll was made from that mould and became something more through the dream's influence, or the mould is for something that resembled the doll's physical form without being the same thing the dream contains. Gehrman's fighting style, when analysed frame by frame in the boss encounter, uses technique that is not entirely consistent with the Burial Blade's item description. The description presents the weapon as designed for reaching things at distance, for retrieving from afar. Gehrman uses the weapon primarily in close quarters during the encounter, in a style that emphasises control and suppression of the space immediately around him rather than the reach the description implies. Either the description refers to an earlier use of the weapon, before Gehrman's joints and his situation changed, or what he is retrieving during the fight is something that has come very close to him already. There is a specific piece of floor geometry in the Nightmare of Mensis that vibrates at a frequency inconsistent with the standard animation rate used for other environmental objects in the game. The movement is subtle enough that it does not read as shaking or trembling during normal play, but it is measurable through frame analysis. The geometry is part of a wall section with no interactive properties and no associated lore. The game's engine is producing an output in one specific location that it does not produce anywhere else, and there is no triggering event associated with it. That piece of wall moves differently. Chapter 4. Shapes in the peripheral vision. There is a staircase in Yharnam that spirals downward in the architecture of the underground area and has no accessible bottom. The rendering engine draws the staircase to a point and then stops generating detail. Players who have clipped through the floor geometry at the staircase's visible limit and descended further have found that the spiral continues but becomes geometrically inconsistent below the visible range. The lines and edges do not resolve cleanly. The staircase was modelled downward to a point, and then the modelling became uncertain. Whether the uncertainty reflects an unfinished design or a deliberate representation of architectural impossibility is not established. The lecture building's main lecture hall has student desks aligned in rows that, when the player traces their orientation, converge on a focal point in the room's upper left corner rather than on the chalkboard at the front. The chalkboard has content on it, and it is a reasonable assumption that the desks should face it. They do not. They face the upper corner. The crack in the ceiling of that corner is the only distinctive feature at the point where the desks point. Students sat at those desks and attended to the crack in the ceiling rather than the board. Whatever was there was more interesting than the lesson. The empty phantasm shell is described in its item text as a hollow vessel left behind by a phantasm, a class of creature associated with the cosmos and the knowledge held in the old blood. The item art shows the shell's interior as smooth and empty. The 3D model of the item, accessed through the game's files, has faint texturing on the inside surface consistent with long-term habitation. Whatever lived in the shell spent enough time there to leave marks on the inside. The marks were smoothed when the item art was created, but not when the 3D model was finalized. The bloodstain mechanic that allows players to leave a record of their last 30 seconds for other players to observe has a documented behavior under specific conditions where the recording period is shorter than the stated 30 seconds. Players who have coordinated deliberately to test the clipping behavior have found that the recording terminates early when the player performs a specific combination of inputs in a specific sequence before death. The game clips the playback before the death is shown. The editing of certain death records is not explained by any accessible documentation. Some deaths are shorter in the record than they were in life. Ludwig's Holy Blade, in its base form before the trick transformation, is a straightforward sword with attack properties appropriate to its size and description. The transformation animation extends the weapon into its blade and holy-like configuration, significantly increasing range and damage values. The transformation shows the original sword's physical form being separated as a component of the process. The Holy Blade is inside the original sword. The full weapon is present from the first moment the player equips it. You carry the Holy Blade from the beginning, without being able to use what it actually is. The transformation reveals rather than creates. There is a room type in the Chalice dungeons that is labelled in the architectural geometry as storage, based on examination of the room's design against similar labelled spaces. This room type, when it appears in procedurally generated dungeons, always contains no enemies and no items. No version of this room type in any known dungeon generation has ever contained anything. It is the only room type labelled with a function that produces an empty room without exception. The label accurately describes a room with nothing in it. Either the storage was cleared before the player arrived, or storage in this context means something different from what it implies. When the player encounters the amygdala positioned on the path in the Forbidden Woods near the Bergenworth Bridge, This amygdala is stationary and cannot be provoked to move by any conventional interaction method. Players who have attempted to trigger movement through extended environmental interactions have found one specific input combination that produces a single step from the creature before it returns to its stationary position. The step is oriented toward Björgenworth. The amygdala, given one moment of triggered movement, moves toward the building that sits at the end of the bridge. Then it stops. The charred hunter set, worn by the corpses of hunters found in the burned areas of Old Yharnam, has item text stating the set was designed to resist fire as one of its primary protective functions. Old Yharnam was set on fire by Dura's collaborators at some point before the events of the game. The hunters found wearing the charred set are dead in the burned area. The fire resistance did not preserve them. Either the fire used to burn Old Yharnam exceeded what the set was rated to handle, or the hunters wearing the set were not killed by fire in Old Yharnam and were brought to or found in the area after death for reasons the lore does not explain. The Winter Lantern's heads, when the player observes them from behind while the enemy faces away, lack the lantern mechanism visible from the front. The back of the head is smooth, without the light source structure that is responsible for the Winter Lantern's name and visual identity. Players who have tested whether keeping a Winter Lantern at their back reduces frenzy build-up find that it does not. Frenzy accumulates at the same rate, regardless of whether the player can see the front of the Winter Lantern's head. A lantern is not the source of what the Winter Lantern does. There is a fountain in the cathedral ward that flows with clear water, rather than the blood-tinged water that appears in most fluid effects elsewhere in the game. The fountain's water is rendered with a distinctly lighter appearance that players in comparative screenshots have confirmed is not blood-coloured. The pipe visible in the fountain's geometry connects to a wall that the player cannot pass. The source of the clean water is on the other side of a wall in an area the player cannot access. Whatever keeps that water clean is not accessible and has no lore description. The Lawrence boss fight in the Old Hunter's Dielk presents Lawrence in a state that includes his clerical garb from before his transformation. His head, the part of him that most visibly carried his human identity, remains intact for the first phase. During the second phase transition, the head detaches and falls to the ground. It continues to animate after separation. The head watches the remainder of the fight from where it landed. It has eyes and they move. There is a chair in the Healing Church main hall, arranged to face the room's entrance door, rather than the altar at the room's front. Every other chair in the hall faces the altar in the expected configuration for a worship space. This one chair faces the door. From the position of that chair, a seated occupant would have a direct sight line to anyone entering the hall from the main entrance. Someone sat in that seat in order to watch who came in, not to attend the service. The amygdala that can be fought in the Nightmare Frontier has a lower health total than the amygdala that appears as a boss in the Chalice Dungeon version of the same encounter. The ratio by which the Nightmare Frontier version's health is lower matches to within a close approximation. The ratio by which the moon visible in the Nightmare Frontier sky is smaller than the moon visible in the Nightmare of Mensis. Community members who have confirmed both ratios numerically have proposed that the two quantities are connected by a shared underlying value. What that value represents, if the connection is real, has not been resolved. The pungent blood cocktail, a consumable item used to attract and distract beasts, is described in its item text as medical waste repurposed for use as a lure. The smell it produces is specifically attractive to beasts in a way that makes them investigate rather than feed. The item text notes this distinction, that beasts approaching the cocktail are not feeding, they are searching for something in the smell. What they recognise and are seeking in the smell of repurposed medical waste is not identified anywhere in the lore. The beast smells something familiar in it and move toward it looking for a source. There is a narrow window in the enemy patrol of the early central Yharnam area, a specific gap created by the patrol cycle of one enemy positioned at a critical bottleneck, through which a player moving at sprint speed can pass without triggering a fight. The window is exactly long enough for the sprint to succeed if started at the right moment. Nothing in the game directs the player to observe the patrol cycle or to attempt the timing. Most players engage the enemy directly or find another route. The gap exists in the encounter design and is large enough to be used, small enough to miss, and close enough to a useful shortcut that it rewards a player who spends time watching before acting. The fishing hamlet has a locked hut accessible by sight through a window. Inside the hut, visible through the window, is a seated figure at a table. On the table in front of the figure is a cup. The cup is rendered with enough detail that its contents are partially visible. Players who have used photo mode to examine the cup at maximum zoom have consistently described the contents as a dark colour that is not consistent with the game's blood texture. Whatever is in the cup is not blood. The fishing hamlet is full of blood, and the person in the locked hut was drinking something else when they stopped. When the player returns to the Orphan of Kos boss arena after completing the encounter, the shoreline shows changes from its state during the fight. Items appear near the body of Kos that were not present during the encounter. These items, which cannot be picked up, include what players have identified as a small shell and an object resembling a comb or a flat decorative item. These items appear after the fight and are positioned near the body with care. Someone placed them after the orphan died. Whatever performed the gesture is not visible in the area after the fight. The Yharnam lamp that the player receives upon being captured and transported to the underground area is inside an unlocked cell. The player is captured by powerful black phantoms and deposited in the underground, but the cell they are placed in is not locked. The key to the cell is in the lock on the player's side of the door. The captors place the player in a cell they could leave immediately if they chose to. The School of Mensis collected the player, transported them to their underground, left them in an unlockable cell with the key in the door, and departed. Whatever they wanted from this interaction did not require keeping the player. There is a sewer grate in the central Yharnam underbelly that produces audible rushing water when the player stands near it. The closest visible water in the game world near this grate is a significant distance away, further than any pipe connection visible in the environmental geometry would account for. Players who have analysed the audio direction of the rushing water sound relative to the grate confirm the sound comes from directly below the grate's position. The water is directly underneath. Whatever the water is connected to exists below the rendered game world and is not accessible. The item text for the Kin Coldblood, the experience item dropped by enemies classified as kin, notes that creatures who have evolved closer to the cosmos in nature still produce bloodstones and blood-derived items when their bodies break down. The text calls this fact a paradox. This is one of the only moments in Bloodborne's item writing where the author editorializes with that specific word. The writer found this strange enough to say so in the item description. The kin are changing into something beyond blood, and they are still full of blood when you kill them. When the player bows at the Tomb of Odin, a large empty structure associated with a Great One defined entirely by formlessness and absence, nothing responds. Bowing at most notable environmental features triggers something, even if that something is subtle. The tomb is the notable exception among interactive objects. Odin has no body and no physical presence in the lore. The tomb bows cannot be acknowledged because acknowledging them would imply something present to receive the bow. The consistency between Odin's lore and the behaviour of his tomb is precise. He is not there. The game agrees. The choir intelligencer enemy type found in the upper cathedral area has a documented gaze behaviour that does not track the player. Enemies generally orient their eyes and attention toward the player character or the player's last known position. The intelligencer's eyes move to positions in the empty space of the room during the encounter. Players who have tested what is at those positions through every available method have not found any object, trigger, or interactive elements. The Intelligencer is watching something. The community has proposed they are tracking entities that are only visible to characters with sufficient insight, and that the game simply does not render for the player at standard insight levels. The lecture building's second floor has one room accessible only through a window on the building's exterior. The window is the route the game intends, and the architecture presents no other path. The room has a door inside it that leads to a corridor visible through the door's window. The door is locked from the corridor side. The corridor the door leads to is not accessible to the player by any known route in a stable game state. The room was designed to be entered from the corridor. The window entrance was added after the corridor route was closed. Both the window and the locked door exist in the final game. The lake visible below the fishing hamlet, accessible to the player in the Dielk environment, has directional audio that changes as the player moves along the shoreline or dips into the shallows. Specific sounds become louder when the player moves toward the hamlet's north end. Different sounds become louder near the south end. The audio sources are beneath the surface of the water and are not represented by any visible object. Whatever produces the sounds in the lake is distributed across the lake bed unevenly, and it makes sound that carries through the water to the surface. The cut content recovered by data miners from Bloodborne's files includes design assets for a faction called the Choir of Mensis that appears nowhere in the released game. The faction's aesthetic in the cut assets combines visual elements from both the Choir and the School of Mensis, the two factions that are most directly at odds in the game's lore. The design suggests the combined faction predates the split between the two groups as a concept. If this reading of the cut content is accurate, the differentiation between the Choir and the School of Mensis was a late structural decision in the game's development rather than a feature of the setting from the beginning. When the Bloodborne Platinum trophy unlocks, the trophy tile shows a moon. Community members who compared this moon to the moons visible across the game's multiple endings found that the trophy moon does not match any of them. The trophy moon is smaller than the moon presence, as depicted in the third ending, positioned differently than the moon in the second ending, and not consistent with the moon in the first ending's sky. The trophy moon may represent the moon before the events of the game, when it was still simply a moon rather than a presence. It is the fourth moon, the one that was there before anything went wrong. Eileen the Crow can be found dead by the player in certain playthrough configurations where the player does not progress her questline at the correct pace. Her body, when found, is in a position consistent with her having died while still standing, or while continuing to fight, having slumped from an upright position. The enemy responsible for her death, the Bloody Crow of Canehurst who kills her in this scenario, is not present near her body when the player arrives. Either Eileen moved herself after the fight, or the Bloody Crow moved away. She did not die where the fight ended. The Bloodborne intro cinematic, which plays before the title screen on first launch of the game, has been subjected to spectral analysis by community members interested in the audio content. The background audio of the hospital scene in the cinematic contains a pattern that community members have identified as consistent with the game's insight gain sound, buried under the ambient audio of the scene. The cinematic appears to contain the insight gain effect in its audio bed. The game grants the player character something before the player presses a button for the first time. The night begins before it begins. Chapter 5. What the Archive Does Not Say. There is a variation of the Forbidden Woods hidden cave area, accessible through a drop in a rock formation rather than along the main path, that contains a pool of dark water and a crystal lizard. Every crystal lizard in every location in the game is programmed to flee from the player at a set proximity threshold. The crystal lizard in this cave does not flee at any distance. It holds its position and allows the player to approach without moving. Whether this is a programming anomaly specific to this instance or a deliberate behavioural distinction applied to this particular lizard has not been resolved by data meaning. The lizard simply does not leave. The Healing Church's central symbol, when examined at high resolution in the environments where it appears as architectural decoration, contains a secondary glyph at its centre that is distinct from the outer design elements. The outer design is associated through its visual language with extension, reach, and spreading out, which fits the Healing Church's stated mission of spreading blood ministration to the population of Yharnam. The inner glyph at the symbol's centre is associated through its visual language with enclosure and retention. The Church's symbol says two things simultaneously, and only one of them is the thing the Church publicly represents itself as doing. The Keeper of the Old Lords appears as a boss in two Chalice dungeon contexts that differ enough in the boss's movement speed and weapon handling to suggest that the two versions represent the same entity at different points in a biological aging process. The older presenting version moves more slowly and handles the weapon with degraded precision. The younger presenting version is more aggressive and moves with greater efficiency. Both occupy the same role in the dungeon structure. The entity that occupies this dungeon has been there long enough that the game contains both a young version and an old version of it. There is an NPC in the Cathedral Ward who appears only after a specific configuration of other NPC questline events has been triggered, and who is gone after the first and only conversation they have with the player. They do not leave a body, they do not leave an item, they simply do not appear when the player returns to the location. The conversation they have with the player is about a person they loved whose name they can no longer remember. They remember the person, they cannot remember the name. They leave after saying so. The blood tinge stat, which governs the effectiveness of firearms and blood-based attack types, is described in its connected item texts not through the language of skill or technique, but through the language of emotion. Items that scale with blood tinge describe their power in terms of passion, grief, or sustained rage, rather than in terms of training or physical capability. Blood tinge functions as an emotional stat in a game that otherwise presents its stats in terms of physical development. The blood responds to feeling. The most powerful blood tinge weapons are not held by the most skilled users. They are held by the most affected ones. The Chikage, the vile blood sword that drains the user's health when in transformed mode, is described in its item text as a weapon that takes blood from its user deliberately, as part of its designed function. The text presents this self-harm as a feature rather than a flaw. Someone at Canehurst designed a sword that required the user to bleed for each second it remained transformed, and described the resulting exchange, user's blood for enemy blood, as elegant. The lore word for this exchange is not sacrifice. The design language positions the user's ongoing blood loss as the mechanism, not the cost. There is a point on the Nightmare Frontier map where the player can stand and look across a chasm at geometry that is fully rendered but not accessible through any known traversal method. The geometry includes what appears to be a complete building, not a ruin or fragment, with intact walls and structural features. Players who have compared the architectural style of the unreachable building to known structures have placed it closest in visual design to the Byrgenwerth lecture buildings. A Byrgenwerth building appears to exist somewhere in the Nightmare Frontier, rendered and complete and unreachable by any method. The item text for the umbilical cord, the third of the required items to trigger the true ending, states that it is one of several. The number available to the player within the game's accessible content is either 3 or 4 depending on DLC completion. Several implies more than 4. The cords the player collects are a subset of a larger number that the item text treats as established fact. The remaining cords are not described as lost, destroyed, or held by named parties. They simply are not accounted for. Somewhere in the logic of the game's world, additional cords exist with no story attached to them. The Nightmare class creatures, including brainsuckers and related entities found in the Nightmare areas, share a base movement speed that does not scale with their physical dimensions the way enemy movement typically does in the game. Larger enemies move faster in most cases. Nightmare-class enemies of significantly different sizes move at the same speed as the smallest members of the class. The Nightmare maintains a consistent pace regardless of the physical form its occupants take, one speed across every shape and size. The Nightmare is uniform in a way that the surface world is not. There is a locked gate in the Yharnam underground area that cannot be operated from either side by the player. Through the bars, a complete dungeon room is visible, including floor, walls, ceiling, and a single item in the center of the floor. Community members who have used photo mode at maximum zoom and optimal angle have identified the item as consistent with the Hunter's Bone model. No key for this gate has been found in any explored location. The room is there, the item is there, and there is no way in. The Simon the Harrowed bow, used in the variant of his questline encounter where he fires arrows, produces impact sounds on the player character that are different from the impact sounds of arrows fired by other ranged enemies in the game. Other bow enemies produce an impact sound that community members have described as forceful. Simon's arrows produce an impact sound that is softer, with a quality associated in the game's audio design with precision-aimed strikes rather than powerful ones. The sound design distinguishes between someone firing to harm and someone firing to aim. When the player destroys all skull lamps in the Yharnam area, the change in lighting reveals architectural details in the walls and floors that are not clearly visible under normal lighting conditions. The newly visible details are consistent with Pthumerian construction patterns found in the Chalice dungeons. Yharnam was built on, or constructed from materials taken from, an older Pthumerian structure. The School of Mensis chose their underground location deliberately, and the location they chose was already significant before they arrived. The Living Failures plant-based projectile attacks are labelled in the game's internal code not as attacks, but as attempts. The label is not accessible to players through normal gameplay, but is visible in datamine files. Whoever scripted the encounter wrote the projectile events as attempts rather than assaults. The coding vocabulary suggests an authorial understanding of these enemies as genuinely trying to accomplish something with each action rather than performing trained offensive behaviours. They are attempting in the code. They are failing in the game. There is a section of the research hall floor that produces an echo when the player walks across it that is distinct from the echo produced by the floor surface immediately surrounding it. The materials appear identical in texture and colour. The auditory distinction is consistent with a hollow space beneath that floor section. Nothing in the game is accessible beneath that area through any known method. The hollow space, if it is there, contains nothing the game renders or describes. The Great One Coldblood, among the highest experience items in the game, has an item description that contains an internal contradiction. The first sentence describes the Coldblood's worth as extraordinary. The second sentence describes the same quality using language that places it in a common category. The two sentences do not agree about what the item is. One possible reading is that different writers contributed to the description and the contradiction was not caught. Another reading is that the item's worth is genuinely uncertain and the description reflects that uncertainty honestly. The choir garb, when equipped by the player, subtly changes the doll's vocal performance in her dialogue in The Hunter's Dream. The change has been confirmed by community members who have recorded and compared the doll's responses to the same dialogue prompt while wearing the choir garb and while wearing other equipment. The difference is a tonal quality in her delivery, rather than different words. She responds differently to the same prompt, depending on what the player is wearing. She reads the garment. There is a building in the Hemwick Charnel Lane area that is architecturally consistent with a church or chapel, including its proportions and the character of its construction, but lacks any religious symbol on its exterior face. Every other religious or worship-adjacent building in the game has identifying external markings. This building has none. Inside the building, the Witch of Hemwick encounter begins. The witch's practice does not use the visual iconography of any identified religion in the game. The building belongs to something older than the symbols. When the player fights the shadow of Yharnam, the three-shadow encounter, the transition to the encounter's second phase occurs at a point triggered by the first shadow's death. Players who kill the shadows in the reverse order from the game's implied sequence find the transition triggers approximately 4 seconds earlier in the encounter's timeline. The encounter's environmental state change is triggered by one specific shadow's death, regardless of kill order. The shadow the game expects the player to ignore is the shadow the encounter is tracking. The Thumaru Ehil Chalice is described as the most significant of the Great Chalice rituals in its item text. The boss it unlocks, Queen Thumerian Yharnam, is the oldest entity accessible as a boss in the game, based on the timeline implied by the lore. Her health total and attack values are balanced to be appropriate for a player who has progressed through the Chalice dungeon system fully. She is the oldest thing in the game, and her combat values were adjusted to match when the player encounters her. What she was at full strength at the peak of the Thumerian civilization is not represented by her in-game statistics. Cainhurst Castle is described in item text as the site of a massacre carried out by the executioners under orders from the Healing Church. Players who have counted the visible body positions, available casket spaces, and gravesite locations in the castle area, and compared these numbers against the implied historical population of a castle of the castle's physical size, have found the count inconsistent. Either more people died in the massacre than could plausibly have lived in the castle, meaning people were brought from outside, or many of the dead were moved away before the player arrives, and the visible bodies are a fraction of the total. A hat worn by a specific Watcher enemy variant in the Chalice dungeons has a model that includes the full set of item properties consistent with a droppable player inventory item. The hat does not appear in the player inventory and cannot be obtained through any standard gameplay interaction, including the enemy's death. Data miners who have examined the hat's model data have confirmed it has a complete item setup, including weight, durability, and defense values. The hat was built to be dropped, and the drop was removed. The Watcher still wears it. The abandoned old workshop contains a partial doll figure on a shelf that is not the plain doll, but is consistent with an earlier iteration of a similar form. Players who use the make contact gesture while standing facing this partial figure receive an insight point. No other partial or damaged object in the game responds to the gesture with insight. The partial figure has enough presence or enough awareness to give the player something when addressed. Whatever was in the process of being built in that workshop was aware. Simon's Bowblade, the hybrid weapon available in the DLC, deals split physical and arcane damage in its bow configuration. This split damage type was not announced or described in any pre-release coverage of the DLC content. Players who tested the weapon extensively after the DLC launched noticed the split-through damage output inconsistencies that did not match the expected values for pure physical damage. The arcane component is real and consistent. It simply was not mentioned. The item text for the Formless Odon rune contains the word also in a grammatical position that implies the stated information is an item in a list rather than the complete description. The sentence structure reads as if previous entries in the list exist but are not included. Read this way. The formless nature of Adon's existence is one thing among several things that the rune conveys, and the rune's full text is either missing its prior entries or was written to imply them without stating them. There is a bloodstain on the Nightmare Frontier that shows a player dying from falling damage while standing on flat ground with no nearby drop. The death animation used in the record is unambiguous about the cause. Players who have tested the bloodstain location extensively have confirmed there is no ledge, no drop, and no obvious source of the falling damage in the immediate environment. The player whose death this records fell from somewhere that the current terrain does not contain. The terrain changed, or they came from somewhere other than the ground when they died. The church doctor garments worn by certain human form enemies in the cathedral ward and healing church have glove textures with staining that is not consistent with blood. Bloodstains elsewhere in the game have a specific colour and distribution that the community has used to identify blood on surfaces. The glove staining is a different colour and has a different absorption pattern. Community members who have compared the stain characteristics to known substances in the game world have suggested it is consistent with the application of numbing agents, specifically the numbing mist item. The church doctors treated their hands before touching patients. The final ending of Bloodborne, Childhood's Beginning, shows the moon ascending or appearing in the sky after the moon presence is defeated. The moon in this ending does not rise from below the horizon with a rising animation. It appears. The sky transitions and the moon is present without having travelled to that position through any visible movement. This distinction between a thing that rises and a thing that becomes visible is a meaningful one in the context of a game where awareness and perception are consistently presented as different from objective presence. The moon was there, the player became able to see it. Yharnam is the first hunter, and his burial blade is described as the first trick weapon ever made. The trick weapons in the game vary enormously in complexity, from the straightforward toggle of the burial blade to the elaborate multi-stage transformations of later weapons. The defining feature of the burial blade's trick is its simplicity. It goes from short to long. One change. The weapon that established the category of trick weapons is the one with the smallest trick. Every elaboration that follows is built on top of that first, plain transformation. There is a window in the lecture building that overlooks an enclosed courtyard accessible from a different route. When the player stands in the courtyard and looks upward at the window room appears to be lit from an interior source. When the player reaches the window room by travelling through the building, there is no light source in the room. The furniture and geometry do not include anything that emits light. The light visible from the courtyard has no object that produces it when approached from the inside. The room is darker from the inside than from below it. The blood of the Great Ones, referenced across multiple item texts as the source of the healing church's power and the foundation of blood ministration, is never described in any item text in terms of its colour. Every direct description of the blood of the Old Ones uses words that are about property, quality, or character, rather than appearance. One text says the blood was deep, another says it was correct, a third says it was sufficient. None of these are about colour. Whatever the blood of the Great Ones actually looked like, the game decided not to say so. The plain doll has a music box in the hunter's dream that plays a recognisable melodic phrase. The music played by her box shares harmonic characteristics with the hunter's dream main theme, but is at a different tempo and in a different arrangement. Players who have analysed the two pieces together have described the relationship as one original influencing the other. But the direction of influence is ambiguous. The doll's box could be playing a simplified version of the dream's theme, or the dream's theme could have been constructed around what the doll's box already played. Which came first is a question the game provides no clear answer to. The Hemwick Witch pair, the dual boss encounter in Hemwick Charnel Lane, is structured visually and through enemy placement to direct the player toward one witch before the other. The encounter's design draws attention to the more visually prominent witch, the one positioned more centrally and who is more immediately aggressive. Killing the secondary witch first ends the encounter in approximately half the time a player targeting them in the expected order would take. The game allows both orders and does not acknowledge them as different. The shorter path through the encounter is available and is invisible. When the player character dies and respawns at a lantern, the character rises from a lying position in the respawn animation. The direction the character faces when they stand up at the completion of the animation varies depending on which direction the intended path forward is from that specific lantern. The character does not face the lantern, does not face a random direction, and does not face where the player was going when they died. They face the way forward from the lantern. This has been confirmed at every lantern in the game by community members who have tested respawn orientation against known path directions. The character knows where to go before the player does. Chapter 6. Dead Languages and Deliberate Silences, the Healing Church Bell Towers. Visible in the distance from multiple areas of central Yharnam and Cathedral Ward, have different numbers of bells visible from different vantage points. This is normally explained by perspective and architectural occlusion, but community members who have compared counts from all accessible viewpoints have found the numbers inconsistent in a way that cannot be entirely attributed to geometry. The same tower, viewed from two different positions, shows different bell counts. Either the number of bells changes depending on where you observe the tower from, or the tower's representation in different areas of the map is not geometrically continuous. The Beast Roar Hunter tool, which allows the player to generate a beast like Shockwave, using the power of beasts, has an audio component that includes a frequency not present in any actual beast's vocalization in the game. The tool produces a sound that combines beast audio with something that is not beast audio. Spectral analysis of the Beast Roar's sound has found a harmonic element consistent with human vocal distress underneath the beast like surface sound. The tool uses the power of beasts. What powers the human element of its sound is not described. There is a grave in the Hemwick Charnel Lane area that faces the wrong direction. Every other grave in the lane faces a consistent direction relative to the lane's layout, which is a real historical practice tied to religious orientation of burial sites. This one grave faces 90 degrees from all the others. Whether the person buried there was given a deliberate deviation from the norm, or whether the person was buried separately from the others in a way that reflects their status, or whether the grave orientation is a detail no one involved in the lane's design thought about closely, is not established. The Augur of Ebrietas Hunter tool summons a tentacle-based attack associated with one of the Great Ones. The animation for the Augur shows the player character holding their hand in a specific receiving posture before the tentacle arrives. The posture is not defensive, it is receptive. The player character is not generating the attack. They are holding out their hand and something arrives in response. The Augur does not invoke a power from within. It signals to something outside and asks it to come. There is a small figure visible in the window of a building in central Yharnam during the early part of the game that disappears if the player comes back to the same window after progressing the story past certain checkpoints. The figure is not an interactive NPC, not something the player can speak to, and not associated with any questline. It is simply present in the window during an early period and then absent afterward. No game event is flagged to its disappearance. Community members have confirmed it disappears consistently, but have not identified what triggers the removal. The item text for the empty rope is one of the shortest item descriptions in the game. It states that the rope is empty. Nothing else. Ropes in Bloodborne appear in multiple contexts across the game, used as ties, as restraints, and as structural elements. The empty rope is an item the player can hold and use, and its description provides no information about what it was previously full of, or what the emptiness means in terms of its function. It is described as an empty rope, and the description stops there. The choice to say nothing further about a describable object is itself a kind of description. The Madarus Whistle, a hunter tool obtained through a questline involving a pair of twin hunters, summons a serpent to assist in battle. The whistle's item text references one twin. The questline from which it comes involves two. The tool does not reference the second twin, pressing the community toward whether the whistle was made by one twin or both twins, and whether only one twin knew the serpent, has not produced a resolved answer. The second twin's role in making or using the whistle is absent from the item text in a way that feels like it was deliberately omitted. There is a building in Cathedral Ward that has no entrance. It is visible from multiple angles, its exterior is fully rendered, and its architecture suggests an interior. No door, window opening, or structural gap allows the player to enter it from any accessible angle. Players who have clipped through the exterior walls have found the interior is not rendered. The building exists as a facade and nothing else, but its placement in the environment is specific enough and its architecture is detailed enough that it reads as a building rather than a decorative backdrop. The tiny music box item, obtained from Gascoigne's daughter, can be used as a weapon in addition to its story-based function. Using it while a beast-type enemy is within range, plays the tune, and affects the beast. Most beast enemies react to the tune minimally. Gascoigne reacts to it uniquely because of his connection to the music box. Players who have used the tiny music box near every accessible beast-type enemy in the game to test for unique reactions have found one additional beast, not Gascoigne, that responds to the music box differently from the standard reaction. Which beast and what the reaction is has been documented in community resources. The game does not acknowledge it. The Kirkhammer weapon Stonehammer mode, the larger of its two forms, has a secondary sound effect when it connects with the ground after a slam attack that plays underneath the primary impact sound and is distinct from it. The secondary sound is consistent with something cracking rather than something being struck. Players who have used the slam attack repeatedly in the same location have confirmed the secondary sound does not change over time, meaning the game is not simulating an actual crack in the surface. The sound is built into the weapon's impact audio and implies damage to the weapon itself with each heavy use. There is a set of Madman's knowledge items in the game which grant insight when consumed, and their item texts collectively describe the experience of gaining forbidden knowledge from sources the human mind was not equipped to process. The descriptions are consistent with each other except for one. One Madman's knowledge has an item text that describes the knowledge as welcome, as something the person who gained it had been looking for. Every other Madman's knowledge is described as unwanted or overwhelming. One person was pleased to find what they found. That person's item text is physically identical to the others. The Canehurst Castle drawbridge, which the player must lower to access the castle interior, is operated by a mechanism on the castle side. The mechanism would have been operated by someone inside the castle to allow entry to arriving guests or to facilitate exits.